I'm Viv Gordon. I'm a theatre maker and survivor activist, and it's my great pleasure to kick things off this morning with a couple of poems. Um, so I describe myself as a service dodger. I've managed to dodge services by being a traveller and things like that, and being in environments where it was all right for me to be quite messy and to be distressed and to feel held. But I have at times engaged with services, and this is a poem called 6 Verses about one time that I engaged with sort of primary mental health services. I get 6 sessions to answer a lifetime spent floating outside myself, trying to come in. I have 6 reasons to stay in this body, but I cannot remember them, not even one. It takes 6 minutes to tick all her boxes, how food is a nonsense, and still I can't sleep. I have 6 hours with the woman, her training, her offering of labels and drugs I don't want. It takes 6 seconds to absorb her word, stuck, and watch myself drowning, engulfed in its wake. I have 6 words to spit back at the woman, evidence and outcomes and fuck you, you arsehole. I have 6 months, which I don't think I'll last through. I'm staring at nothing and brick walls and nooses. I have 6 women who hold my heart gently and tell me I matter until I believe them. I have 6 songs now I sing to the women. They all start with hope and they all end with change. And I'm just going to do one more before you get stuck into the main content of the day. And so this is from a show that I toured a couple of years ago now called Oral. And it's about my experience of childhood sexual abuse, of oral abuse, and subsequent sort of cultural silencing, and my experience of barriers accessing dentistry and oral care. It's quite complex, but it ends with this call to arms, and so I thought it was quite a good motivating way to start the meeting today. I'm going to run. I'm going to run down the stairs and out of the building. I'm going to run up the street and down the next street. And I'm going to keep on running until I find the green. And I will not let anything get in my way. And I will run to the top of the highest hill, and I will speak, and people will listen, because what I have to say is important. And what I have to say is this: it's not just me. This is not just my story. There are thousands, millions of people just like me walking around in this deafening silence. Lots and lots and lots of people. Same story, different details. Same story, same excruciating denial. And now it's time for the world to listen, because something has to change. This can't go on forever. So I am going to run, and I am going to speak, because I can. And I'm telling you, and you need to pay attention. You need to be part of the change. There is no cozy middle ground here. There is no neutral position. You're either running with us, changing things, or you're keeping everything the same, and you don't want to be that person, because this is shit. This is shit that we cannot run away from, that we can only run towards, weeping and hollering and fierce and raging. And together We're going to get through this. You and me, all of you and all of me together. And that's just how it is. And that's just how it's going to be. And that's me. I hope you have a really great time this morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Viv. Really appreciate you coming. And I think you're absolutely right. It is time for the world to listen. Things really need to change and we all need to be part of it. And I think that was just such a great introduction to today's session. So thank you ever so much. Shame we don't have an audience. I feel like we need to have a big clap in the background. So hello, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the launch of the New System Alliance. That's really set the tone for today. I'm really chuffed. So today's session, we're going to be exploring the art of fixing. And when we listen to people during what was our first Wisdom from the Street, which was nearly 10 years ago now, one of the main things that really stood out was how when we label people to identify their needs in order to provide a prescriptive service, a solution, a fix for people's perceived problems, the damage caused can be huge. And I remember the quote from that wisdom was, "What I need isn't just to come off drugs, quit alcohol and get a job. I need to feel I'm worth something, then I might want to do those things." And I think what often happens is when we focus on weaknesses, on deficits, and we try and fix those, people find themselves trapped not only by their labels or their diagnoses, but also trapped within services and the systems that have been designed to help. But when we focus on people's strengths, when people can evidence for themselves that they can achieve and can explore what's really possible for them, people build on their own abilities and they move towards a more positive, sustainable life. Now, the first Wisdom from the Street was 10 years ago. And we know that this has been going on for a lot longer than that. And hey, it's still happening now, right? So today's session is going to be a bit different to the live conversations that we've been hosting all week. It's a pre-recorded conversation between myself and a guy called Mauricio Miller, who some of you may know. And he's currently in California, so I think it's probably about 1 a.m. there. So it didn't really feel right to try and get him out of bed for a live chat. But Mauricio founded a really impactful and brave new response to working with families on low incomes in America. And he offers a great example of how if we just get out the way and we invest in people, in families and communities and build on strengths, what a different outcome we'd have. Now, he wrote a fab book. It's a recommended text for our PTS qualification, which is this book here. I'll talk about it more in the video. And I know this has had a real impact on people who have managed to read it. So please feel free to use the chat. This is all of our space to have a say. After the video is played, myself and a couple of my friends and colleagues, Catherine and Joanna, will jump on and have a quick reflection just to go over some of your questions. So please post questions, use the Q&A or the chat. Say hi, what brought you here? And if you want to use the chat as a fixing confessional to share how you may have fixed in the past, how you feel you might have to fix now and how that's made you feel. So this is our brave space to have a say. I'm going to post the video link in the chat as well, just in case anybody has any problems with connection. But after the video is played, we'll have a 5-minute break, but honestly, grab a cuppa whenever you like. We'll pull in your comments and thoughts. So here we go, get the kettle on. Kick back and let's take a look at what happens when we trust people, when we get out of the way and we model a world without fixing. Okay, so hello and welcome to the New System Alliance session, where we will explore a world without fixing. I'm Lynn from Mayday Trust, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Mauricio Miller all the way from California. So Mauricio, you're described as a social entrepreneur, founder of the Family Independence Initiative, and author of a wonderful book, quite provocatively titled The Alternative: Most of What You Believe About Poverty is Wrong. And this book's a very personal as well as a professional account of how and why You've been able to model an alternative approach when working with low-income families in America by investing directly in communities. And it really highlights what you learned when you stopped trying to fix and let people lead their own way and use their own resources to work their way out of poverty. And it's a core text for us, for our qualification. So it feels really fitting to invite you into this conversation around systems change and how we model the difference and why this is so important. So to kick off, it would be wonderful to hear from you how you would like to introduce yourself and to hear what you feel is wrong about what people believe about poverty.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here. I'm really honored and great to be able to talk to a whole other group of people. So I've been doing this kind of work for about 40 plus years, and I feel like I'm constantly talking to the same people. So really nice to be with all of you. Please, if you have any questions, I would love to stay connected. And maybe why I'm here and what might be relevant about this whole thing is that I grew up in initially Mexico with my mother and my older sister. She was about 7 years older than me. So I grew up in this female-led family that then immigrated to San Jose, California, looking for, what's generally termed the American dream. It's like there, you can actually succeed if you work really hard. And that what ended up happening is the experience, which is kind of outlined quite a bit in the book, it ended up not being quite the dream that we had hoped. And then the realization that the systems that were set up to be helpful were systems I would not take my own family through. And so that dissidence between, here's what everybody thinks that would be really helpful to families like mine, and the fact that I don't think it works, then led to the book. So what's ended up happening is that I have gotten opportunities to try, again, more what I think your organization and all of you have been looking at is something completely different. So I guess I would not describe myself as a social innovator, because that generally is a term used because we as social innovators somehow are designated as the ones that are going to find solutions for what families are going through and whatever. And what I'm talking about is that no, we have no solutions. The families are the only experts of their own lives. So in that in that context, then that's sort of my personal background and what led me to all this. Out of all that, in terms of what I feel like is really wrong, is that the system that we have developed, and I know we're going to talk about it a little bit more, is a system that really looks at families as not having capability. It actually deals with a stereotype that is very broadly applied to people that are poor, which tend to heavily be people of color, women, anyone who is not seen as the norm.
Yeah.
Especially the norm in Western culture. And so therefore, if you don't fit the norm, especially if you're poor, you're seen as, well, it's kind of your fault. And that's probably because you need us to come save you.
Yeah.
And that whole thing is like, would drive my mother crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we have something very similar with, we work with people that are experiencing homelessness, people coming out of prison, people that are accessing mental health services. And we hear this an awful lot, that as soon as people fall into that situation, they're instantly othered. Mm-hmm. And suddenly they've lost complete control. And so life as they knew it no longer exists. Their lives are putting in the hands of others. And I had a tweet today from one of our coaches that work with people, and it said, and it was a direct quote from somebody, it said, "How do I thrive and succeed with high aspirations in a system that has such low expectations of me?" Right. And I really picked up on that today because I knew I was going to speak to you. Yeah. But it's just, talking about that this was happening, in your childhood. With your mother and your family, but that's still happening now. That was today, and I think that's it's just really interesting that we're still in that position, actually.
It's actually been fascinating because in some ways the whole top down of we are the saviors piece has actually strengthened, at least in the United States, in many ways that I do feel like there are so many people that want to do good, that they actually do understand there is a problem and that want to be involved in solving it. And that is a really good thing. The dilemma is that those people tend to be in more privileged positions, like all of us. And so the reason you can be on here and not be working 2 jobs right now is because we want to do something good. And one of the most difficult things about the kind of approach that that I've been talking about is that it is a criticism of us, those of us that want to do good. And criticizing people that want to do good just doesn't fly well. So it is that I think you have to internalize first that, at least in the United States, after more than 50 years of some of the smartest, most well-intentioned people with trillions of dollars trying to find solutions, have not done it.
Yeah,
what we've done is at least made poverty tolerable for the people that are eligible for the criteria that we set up, which actually does not include the majority of the population that are poor. But the primary thing we've accomplished in helping people is actually make poverty tolerable, to the point at least that they won't then protest. And so I came out of a period in the 50s and 60s where it was like, no, the system is wrong. We're going to help each other. In the United States in the 50s and 60s, it was all people's movements. It wasn't services, it wasn't nonprofits, it wasn't even government. It was, you know, we are actually students and we self-organized. There was a civil rights movement, that Black Pride movement, the Yellow Pride movement. Asians were not the model minority at that time. You know, it was really fascinating. It was all self-help. It was all people grouping together and helping one another. And at that point in time, when the Black Panthers were in Oakland, where I lived and was going to go to school in Berkeley, that at that particular time, you would never see a Black person panhandling, because that community had its own food programs. They were developing their own housing. You were part of the Black community and you were then taken care of. And you also had a responsibility to not let that community be viewed as panhandlers. You know, it was just fascinating how much of a sense of community. But when you start getting a lot of people of color banding together, it starts threatening the system. And so then they were taken down. But for me, I remember that set of movements. I remember the pride in being part of groups that wanted to do something. And it didn't even have to have a leader. You know, people we designated as leaders, but it was really this self-organizing. And I guess what I feel like is part of what you're doing and part of what I'm seeing even in global protests around racial justice, there is now another generation coming up of which we should be part of, that is self-organizing, that it isn't about us coming up with solutions, but it's people banding together and helping one another.
What do you think happened? I mean, because we had a similar experience, you know, we go back 30 years and everything was, you know, it was based in communities. You know, it was other people helping each other. And then suddenly we seem to have created and built up an industry around how we draw down public funds in silos, and how we need to bring in, you know, projects, programs, outcomes. And I think never before have people who have fallen on tough times been so managed. You know, their lives are so exposed and managed, and it's quite phenomenal, I think, how we've got to that point.
So you basically answered the question, because I think you know, in many ways that I think the underlying reason for all of this is that people that are poor, and certainly people of color and anyone that's different, are not trusted.
Yeah.
They're not trusted by those people that control resources,
Yeah.
even if they're well-intended people. And this dilemma of the stereotypes are so deeply embedded in people of privilege that there isn't the basic trust of letting people make their own decisions. So once you're at that, but you want to do good, what you want is you want an accountability system. Every funder will tell you they want accountability. Okay. And the way Western culture deals with accountability is by structuring it.
Yes.
And for the United States, that meant a corporate structure. Executive directors, boards of directors, et cetera. So the IRS then has a nonprofit structure that if you want to get money from those that have it, then you have to incorporate. And this issue of Western corporations, actually, whether they're nonprofit or not, of corporate structures and leading change was just not what existed in the 50s and 60s.
No.
You know, we managed ourselves. We chose our own leaders. Sometimes there weren't any. We just all worked together. So a way of keeping control over people is sort of what you said, is structure them. And so a lot of my work is that we've over professionalized the system to help. And what those of us that want to do good have turned to the nonprofit and the NGO sector in order to be able to both get the funding, feel good about our work, and then be able to then apply what we want. And that has continued the top-down system. So it's sort of like this dual sort of, because you're wanting to do good and the power structures are set up in terms of structure, then you're almost compromised from the very beginning. And this is a really big struggle that those of us that want to do good, that we actually have to face. We have to look in the mirror about our role in terms of basically disengaging, self-organizing, and people's own personal and group responsibility to take care of themselves and each other.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we heard, because when we started on this about 10 years ago, we did this listening exercise, and it was, you know, this started out because of austerity. You know, the organization had got to a position where we're like, we're not going to survive this austerity. So we were looking at mergers, we're looking at all these different things that we would do, and we thought, well, hang on, what are we trying to merge here? Because actually it doesn't feel like what we're doing is actually any good. We kept seeing the same people coming back again. And it just didn't feel right. So when we spoke to people about this, you know, this is one of the things that came back. You know, the outcomes for people just aren't good enough. And it really prompted that reflection of, we are part of this problem, you know, and we really had to take a step back and say, okay, this isn't sitting well. We need to really do something about this. So I think we've got, go on.
Yeah, but you touched on something, which is that that also makes it really difficult in terms of coming up with a very different way of approaching the problem, which is that almost all the quote nonprofits and programs and government initiatives do a little bit of good.
Yeah.
And because they do that, it is again very hard to then be self-critical.
Yeah.
And I can tell you how many people kind of believe of, yes, we kind of get in the way, but you know, my organization actually has done some good. And yes, I'm sure you did. I mean, my organization, I ran services for 20 years, and I got invited by President Clinton to the State of the Union address because we were supposed to be one of the best in the countries. And I already knew that that wasn't good enough. That if what my agency was doing was one of the best in the country, our standards were way too low. And so that is the dilemma, is both it threatens us that want to do good because we want a job, we want a structure is how we get a job, that's how we get paid. It also, this approach really takes a lot of the power away from us.
Yeah.
And so and we can always say, but you know, we did some good. I mean, Habitat for Humanity, it's does really wonderful work. And yet the examples I've heard of is that essentially that they, instead of bringing in volunteers from all over the world, if they actually just took the money that they spent, you know, which is like something 80 or 90,000 for a home that costs $6,000, that, you know, it's just that right now we do some good, but we've actually become a barrier to our own mission.
Definitely. Yeah. And that really resonates. And I think, you know, we had to do a lot of introspection around the problem that we were trying to solve as an organization. So, you know, I think it was very much, we were looking at, you know, we're here to solve homelessness, we're here to end homelessness. And actually, when we listen to people, you know, we really changed that to it's the systemic institutionalization of people when they come into services that's the problem. So we really had to kind of refocus and kind of change why we existed and what we felt that problem was that we were here for. So which is why we started really modeling that more person-led approach.
So, but it's problematic in terms of starting where we are. And so if we're talking about, okay, so how do you move forward from this? You know, my nephew has been, my sister's son, my sister's family went through a lot. You know, there were drugs and everything else. And that my nephew was actually homeless quite a lot of the time. And that in many ways he found going to social services as easier than dealing with family, because family can be pretty tough on you. It's like, you bring drugs into the house, you're out, which is what happened. And what I think I learned from him is that ultimately, once he used up all of his social service eligibilities, he came back to family. And that the hard part about homelessness, which we gave it a name and we legitimized it. It used to be these are winos or whatever, but, and it was sort of this outlier thing. All of a sudden got a category that could be funded and structured, and we could get jobs out of it, that we basically created our own problem.
Yeah.
And for me, it was difficult because my nephew would not come back and actually go by the rules of our family. You don't bring drinks into the house, you act a certain way, you go do this, that he actually felt like it was easier to stay out there and be homeless. He at least had access to that without having, the social workers all felt bad for him or whatever. Ultimately, though, he's had to come back to family because those services don't sustain.
Yeah.
And what we have to do is rebuild what the Black Panthers actually had, which was a sense of community. We're responsible for each other. We have to feed each other. And that is the way it used to be. Yeah. So if you look at, Mississippi or whatever, when it was, and you'll see it in refugee camps. We're starting to work in refugee camps. They have to work with each other. Yeah. And under those circumstances, and I've seen rich people, that's what they do. They work with each other. You go to Mar-a-Lago, you play golf, you cut deals, and you eat at each other's restaurants and hotels and whatever. So it is really about social networks and rebuilding that strength of those networks, which sounds difficult, but really isn't. It's just that we as helpers are not central in that.
Yes, yeah. Because I know that's quite a central part of the Family Independence Initiative. When you invited families into the program, you said, don't come alone, bring your networks, bring your community with you. And how did that work out? So
one of the things, so a lot of the Family Independence Initiative, which was the first one, I left social services and Jerry Brown, who then became governor of California, challenged me of, basically in doing services, you have fundamentally not changed anything. A bunch of poverty pimps, you created jobs for yourselves, right? Which was true, And I was very frustrated by that. And it was right after Clinton invited me. So I was very self-critical because I knew I wouldn't bring my own family members through my own services, that the system for people that are privileged and have money was totally different than what we were trying to give to people. And so it wasn't good enough. What ended up happening is that I wanted to learn, I was forced to be an engineer by my mother. So I had to go to college. And the one thing I liked about engineering was data and statistics. Yeah. And so I wanted data from the families in terms of, I knew where I grew up and I knew the families I grew up with in our neighborhoods, but I didn't know if the situation for the thousands, I think our organization dealt with about 2,000 families a year, for about 20 years. And so I didn't know if their situation was really similar to mine, which is that maybe what I was doing in terms of services wasn't quite right. And so I had developed a data tracking system to capture the data of what people do every month. And I'd been testing it within the nonprofit itself. Yeah. Essentially, then what I wanted to know is the stereotype was that these families did not know what to do, could not figure any way out, and therefore we had to provide services. That was the general stereotype. Again, intuitively, I didn't think that was right, not at least in the neighborhoods I grew up with. And so I wanted the data to find out what really was the capacity in terms of families helping themselves and helping others. And so if you want clean data, you can't be messing it up by having social workers or employment specialists telling the families what to do. So essentially I told, my staff is like, you are liaisons, you are not staff, you're not counselors, you're not advisors, that I need clean data. Your role is to collect the data and do it in a way that you're not intrusive, that somehow or other, they're not trying to please you in order to get resources. So the way it was set up is, okay, what we're gonna do is that we also know families need support, and the primary support for families tend to be family or friends. If they've blown all their relationships with the family, which my nephew did at different points in times, then it was his friends. So almost everybody has family or friends that they can turn to. And so when we started the program, we basically said, look, you will get no staff support from any of us. Therefore, you have to have a support system. So you have to go recruit 5 to 10 other families. And we're doing international work, and the groups right now are about 10 families, because where you're in a developing country, you really are dependent on each other. So everybody kind of got enrolled with a group. And it was the dynamics that that I think I learned again in the 60s, when people were self-organizing. On an individual basis, if you bring one of these families in, one or two, into your meetings and whatever, they don't have power. But what I knew when our students self-organized over there and we were crazy is that when you're in a larger group, you start gaining power. So if you self-organize, all of a sudden you have this sense of power. And so I needed a counterbalance to my staff and their social status and privilege. And so what the families had is like, we're bringing them in groups. As they get together and they know each other and they know their own problems, they will then be more on a peer basis as we start asking questions. So it was also a matter of balancing the power and the social status that exists in society.
Did you ever come across a family that didn't have any networks?
Oh,
and
they would.
I think we found this often when we're working with people that have been quite trapped in services for a long time, that the only people they really know are kind of paid professionals. And like you said, many have kind of drifted away from family and friends. And that must be quite difficult when people present and they want to do something, but if they don't have those networks. Was that something that you worked with people to get them, or what was your response to that?
Well, I think you point out that in many ways we've created that problem, because before there were programs, you know, you could go ahead and individually starve to death, you know, or, you know, you had to go make friends with somebody. And so what's fascinating is in many ways we replaced that sense of community that, you know, people used to exist with. So what would happen is, very often when we went to, you know, what are considered very poor families, they would say, but I don't have any friends to turn to. And so we would say, so I'm sitting in you know, we were recruiting families at the beginning. I'm sitting in public housing, and, you know, one of the families that you know, I'd like to join, but I don't have any friends. And I'm there. So I looked around and said, well, you know, what if there's a fire in here and you have 3 kids? And you can't stay here, where would you stay? And she said, well, you know, I'd stay with Carmen. And I said, well, what if you had to borrow $100, or who would you lend $100 to? Well, you know, there's Philip. And so you do have community. And what it is that when you're very low income, you only think of community in terms of crisis. You know, in terms of solutions, we've got it to the point that they look for nonprofits or professionals. They don't look at their community and their network as probably providing any solutions or opportunities. And I'm over there, look at, you know, right now you've been forced into that situation. You've been told that somehow or other somebody from the outside is going to save you, and that's who you turn to. But no, your community is really right now, like my sister, she'd get beat up. And what was the first place she'd go? If we weren't around as family, she'd go to her friends and stay on the couch with her kids. So that is, you know, essentially, we have created our own problem. But if you actually go talk to people, they do know in a crisis who or what they would turn to. And they just need to then start recognizing that those people are also their opportunity.
Yeah. I think I'd like to just ask you another question just around, it's going back to the power dynamics really, and this issue of a notion of helping. So you were saying before that it's kind of, you're not going to present, you're not going to be the staff, you're not the professional. And there's something that people always talk to me about in your book. When that guy went in and actually started helping families on the side, that you could see through the data that there was something going on there, and you fired the guy. And I think that's one of those things, you know, it's quite, it really stands out to people as, gosh, you know, that's really sensationalist. But it's fascinating to me that was
like, no, it was actually, that came out of the fact that when I very first started the project, I can't say that I totally trusted the families either. I trusted my family and my mother and my sister, but I didn't really, you know, I had embedded some of that same bias. And what we were going to do in order to collect the data is we were going to give each family, and we did give each family a computer. And because we wanted data, it was cheaper to give them a computer than try to have staff professionally go out and interview them every month. It's like, okay, I'll put the surveys online, get the data from you online, and it's just easier to just give you a computer. So as I thought about our population, some are not literate, some have never had a computer and whatever. And so I set up a technology committee to determine how we were going to train those families, how to set up their computer, how to use it, et cetera, et cetera. And in the first groupings that we, basically brought in to get their computers, we had a trainer there and whatever. I happened to be out of town at the time. And so I came back and asked my staff, so how did that first day go giving out the computers? And then my staff is over there, it was terrible. We had the computers up here, and the person that we had to train could not deal with the families or explain it very well. And then the computers at that time were these big boxes, right? And so this was like 2001. And so, essentially we didn't have any hand carts, so they could carry the computers down to the street to get them home. And then half the families didn't have cars. They took buses to get here. And so they couldn't take their computers on the bus. And I'm over there, oh, shoot. So, did anybody get online, and is everything working and whatever? And my staff says, oh yeah. And I'm with her, so how did it happen? And they said, well, there happened to be a 17-year-old at the meeting that they brought that said she'll train everybody how to set up their computers and how to get online. And then, because there weren't hand carts, all the families start helping each other, carrying the computers down to the ground floor. And then, because only half had cars, the ones with cars volunteered to take the computers home with the people that did not have cars. And I'm over there, that's the best thing. They solved their own problems, and it built this sense of we need each other, right? As opposed to we need, FII. And that stuck with me. So when we had this years later, when Roberto tried to, my staff was already told, you help anybody, you're fired, right? And I kind of pushed some people out. But this guy, he was smart. So he was hiding the fact that he was helping people, go online and teaching them, and he was translating from Spanish and whatever. He felt sorry for the families because they weren't literate and because they'd never used, and this thing of feeling sorry for people. My mother had a third grade education in Mexico, but she hated this patronizing attitude that she couldn't learn or pick things up as fast as anybody, and maybe faster than most people. And so she just really, would just get her hairs up about that kind of treatment. And the fact is that this is what Roberto was doing. And actually in the book, I think I changed the name, but anyway. And so when I saw that his time with the families, because we paid him hourly, was going up, but the number of families was not going up. I'm over there, something's going on here. What he did, though, is when he got confronted, and I told him, you're going to be fired, for doing this, and then hiding it from me, he organized the families. And so the families then came in a protest, and he helped them build signs protesting me, that I was firing him. So it's like, keep Roberto's signs and whatever. So I go and meet with the families. And so there's probably about 30 or some families kind of in front of me, and they're there, you have to keep Roberto and whatever, we know that it's not about him really being the savior or whatever. We know it's really about us, and we're supposed to do it and whatever. And so I did two things. One is that I showed him a videotape where some of the right-wing politicians in our country were talking about them as families, of how they're lazy, they don't do anything, they don't know how to do it, they don't help each other. And so I showed him videos of, this is a stereotype about you, okay? So maybe Roberto isn't, disempowering you, but I don't care. The stereotype, this is not about you. This is about stereotypes about all, and this was actually refugees, about all refugees, right? And then I said, so Roberto and there, I had another liaison, so they get paid hourly, and here is the number of the dollars that I'm paying them. And the more that I pay them, the less I have to give to you. And so I said, if, essentially then, if you guys help each other to do what he's helping you do the reports and whatever, I'd rather give a scholarship to you folks to help each other than pay Roberto. And when I start talking about the fact that, and so then again, a really young person, like 18 or 19 or something, stood up. Oh no, the woman in the back said, but I never used a computer. Roberto was the one helping me do all this. And so how am I supposed to do it? Without me saying anything, again, there was this young person that stood up in the front looked back at her and said, I'll help you. I'll help any of you that want. And I'm over there. So that capacity is in your community. You have to find it. And the role is to find it. I want to learn what the capacity is there. And any money I save by firing Roberto, I'll give scholarships to her and the other people. And all of a sudden, protest was over. So, and we went home. So that's sort of what it's about. We have to understand that we can really mess things up.
How did you keep other services away? Because I think, you know, you've almost got that kind of ability to kind of have that response to your own staff. And you mentioned at the beginning around, you know, you tried to get social services out the way, you wanted to just work with these families. And I think we find when we're working with people going through tough times, they are, you know, they can sometimes have 5 to 7 workers involved in their lives. They've got a drug worker, a support worker, they've even got a navigator to help them navigate all the workers they have. You know, so when you're trying to do this person-led approach, it can be really difficult because that experience that they might have, they're then having to work with in a very deficit way with all of these other interventions that are coming into that space.
Yeah, you may have even more helpers. I don't know. I had anywhere from, my family's had from 4 to 6 often, you know, so I don't think we ever reached 7 different, you know, social workers, employment specialists and whatever's or navigators. And one of the things is really, you can't start from there. You have to start by letting the families realize that they are the only experts of their lives. And that the solutions really are embedded in them and their friends. They don't all know, we'll have to talk about positive deviance a little bit, but they don't all know what to do. They really are lost. The fact is though, and this is what behavioral studies will let you know, within any grouping, there is somebody who does something different that deviates from, you know, being stuck to actually doing something successful. And those positive deviants actually can be the steps. They set up the role modeling and steps of what others can do because they're peers. They're in the same circumstance. And so we can go back into a little bit more of positive deviance, but that is actually what shows that the solutions that make sense are embedded in that community. And what you need to do, and that's what rich people do, they'll go to a conference and they'll try to look for the best ideas. And so the issue of networking and even people coming in their groups and then having our groups get together is they start trading ideas. And these are people in a peer situation. It's not all people at Mar-a-Lago that all have a lot of money who again have, you know, come up with certain solutions, but really people that are on a peer level. And your social workers and whatever are not on a peer level. They're not in the same circumstance.
So did people start to actively push them away? Did they start to make their own decisions? Say, I don't need that social worker.
They start making their own decisions. Once they start realizing that they really are the only ones and that they have the best solutions and that they want to pursue that, then they will pick if a social service agency is good for them or not. So, you know, essentially then what ends up happening is we've had families in Albuquerque that liked the social service provider. It's like, okay, that's your choice. If you want to spend time, that's a good place to spend your time, fine. But, you know, also they found that probably their better solutions, what they would have groupings, you know, of people kind of get together with friends and whatever, they'd share dinner, and that's where they kind of learned and they'd start sharing money. And certainly internationally, that's really that sense of community and those being the experts, because NGOs and international aid and government have failed so much in developing countries that the best solutions really are embedded in these families. So it really is actually of letting people realize the power that they do have. And when they start realizing it, they make decisions. So a short story is that one of the families that was probably in with us about a year, and I'd say within 6 months or so, the families start realizing that this is not about us helping them, but about them and the power that they can develop. But, you know, I threaten my staff all the time that you can't help. And so, you know, Tracy was one of the staff people, and she'd been working with, I think it's Tanisha, for about a year. And so Tracy comes one day and says, so, you know, Tanisha has been doing consulting and her income's been growing, but she also had actually tried to apply for Section 8, which is subsidized housing in the United States. And she just got her certificate, but the income eligibility, if she keeps growing her business, she won't be eligible for the Section 8 housing, which is a big subsidy here, right? You guys probably have really big subsidies too. And it's like, and so she's struggling a lot. Is should she kind of close down her business or slow down the growth of her business because she wants her independence and take the Section 8 because, you know, then she has safer housing for her kids, or, you know, should she actually just let the Section 8 go and continue to build her business? And so Tanisha wanted my opinion about it. And Tracy said, you know, for me, when I was on welfare in Ohio, I got off and I bought a house. You know, I'd like to give her my opinion. I don't want to be fired. And so I asked her is that, you know, at this point in time, if you give Tanisha your opinion, is she going to take it like that is actually an expert opinion and she needs to really look at following that? Or is she just going to take it as another opinion by anybody else? By this time, the relationship was more on a peer basis as, oh, Tanisha will take it or not take it. You know, so I said, so then you can give her your opinion. You know, it is that you got to first change the power dynamic.
Yeah.
Once they have power, then they're like you and me. And so what Tracy did is she went back to Tanisha and she said, you know, in my opinion, I think you should go after, you know, build your business and buy the house the way you wanted to and get off the system, which I did. And so I asked Tracy later, so what did Tanisha do? And she says, well, what Tanisha did, I could never advise her. What she did is she started hiding the income from her business. So she continued to grow it. She just hid it. She took the Section 8 so she could get that subsidy. And between the subsidy and hiding her savings, she was able to buy a house.
Yeah, and we experience this. Absolutely. And it's that really difficult position that people find themselves in. It's like, if I get employment, I'm going to lose my housing benefit. If I lose my housing benefit, I'm not going to earn enough to have a roof over my head. And it's just that position that people become trapped in, and you're stuck in that place. And I think that's really fascinating. We touched upon it earlier about the positive deviance. And there's an example in your book about, is it Javier and Maria, about how they kind of really led the charge on this route of positive deviance. It'd be great to hear that story.
Yeah. One of the things at that point in time, I didn't actually know about positive deviance. I just knew what it was like in the neighborhoods I grew up in, which is that my mother would always be looking at the neighbors and who was doing what, and, you know, what she could learn from it, and did they have connections that would help her and whatever. So I just knew that everybody was kind of conscious of everybody else. And my mother didn't know everything that she would need to do either. When I first started FII, then about 7 months into the project, we were working with refugees from the war in El Salvador. And again, we had them come in with other families. I think there were 5 or 6 families in their grouping. I'm beginning to forget. And one of the families was really quiet, Javier and Maria. The other families would talk a lot more. But one day my staff came to me and said, so, you know, Javier and Maria just came and said they're going to buy a house. At that point in time, none of the refugee families had any savings because they were saving, any of the savings they had were sent home through remittances back to El Salvador. And, you know, I had asked them, so why are you sending all your savings? They said, well, because we're going to go back to El Salvador, you know, so we're building assets there. And all of a sudden, this family says they're going to go buy a house. And they were like really quiet family and didn't look like, you know, risk takers or whatever. And then my staff said, and the person that convinced them to buy a house, we think he's a predatory lender and is taking advantage of them. Can we say something? Can we mention that? Can we send them to financial training and whatever? And I'm over there, no, you can't do that. And I felt bad, but remember the engineer in me was, I don't want to screw up the data. Right? And I said, you know, my mother made mistakes. They might be making a mistake, but we're supposed to just learn from that. So what ends up happening is because real estate agents and brokers make their money at closing, he got them to closing. He put in mortgage insurance and all kinds of other stuff. My staff comes to me, yeah, they're closing on the house, but their mortgage payment is 65% of their income. They will not be able to keep that house and still feed their kids and send them to school. So they're going to lose the house. And I felt really bad. It's like, yeah, they're going to lose the house. And the only positive thing I could think of is that as when they lose the house, the rest of the refugee families will know that they should not work with this guy, right? It's like, okay. So then what was fascinating is 2 months later, no, I'm sorry, not 2 months later. After that, what ends up happening is the family calls me and says, because I still spoke Spanish, a little bit of Spanish, that they wanted for me to sit on a refinance. And I'm like, you're able to refinance? And they said yes. So what had happened is that they realized this guy was a predatory lender somewhere along the line. And so they had a refinance clause built into the contract. So when it closed, then they brought all their families. They had to borrow money from everybody in order to do the down payment and everything else. All these people that had invested in this house came down the house, re-landscaped, retiled, repainted the house. They got the valuation of the house up, refinanced, got their payments down to 40%. And at 40%, with this whole group of community around them, there's no way they were going to lose the house. And they still own the house, as far as I can tell. As of 3 years ago, they still own the house, right? And so then it's like, that's fascinating. Again, my staff would never have come up with a solution. Oh, you put a refinance clause and bring all your friends, right? So the next thing that happened, though, is that because our data system tracks savings and income and debt, and we track how their kids are doing in school. Remember, I collect surveys every month as to what they're doing, that all of a sudden the red line for savings for all the other refugee families start going up. So I went to a meeting. It's like, so how come all of you are saving? So they looked at me, and then they turned to Javier and Maria and said, if they can buy a house, we can buy a house. Amazing. Within 18 months, all the other families owned homes in the United States. That's how fast it went. And they helped each other to buy homes. They also had $5,000 come from El Salvador to them in the United States to buy. I'm over there, why are you buying a 5-bedroom house? You know, there's only like 4 of you. And they said, because that's going to be the halfway house for other refugee families coming from El Salvador. They started developing their own helping system. And this was a sense of community. That was the second lesson, okay? The third lesson, they said, is that besides us buying homes, the rest of the refugee families, you know, in our social networks of hearing about this, and they're starting to buy homes, that refugees, you know, from El Salvador never thought they could build assets in the United States, but because of Javier and Nera. So that was the third, actually, lesson I learned from that. The thing that happened 15 years later, I think it was 15 years later, is that I told that story when I did a presentation at Stanford University. And at the end, some people come up to talk to you. So this young man comes up to talk to me after that lecture and that story. And he says, so, you know, my family's from El Salvador, and my mother heard about your families buying up homes. So we bought a house, and it's the equity from that house that has gotten me through Stanford.
Wow.
So the change had been actually generational because I did not have my stuff help. What happened is that Javier and Maria was the positive deviant. You don't have to be a charismatic leader or whatever. They role modeled that it was possible. You know, even though they started in a terrible situation, they, with their community, were able to work out a solution that we could never have helped them on. And that happens every day, everywhere.
Yeah. And such a different approach to risk taking. And I think, you know, that you'd put this to some organizations, and, you know, the more traditional way we work, and you would never have allowed that to happen. You know, you would be straight in there with the advice, straight in with the debt counseling, but being able to sit in that place of just kind of holding that and seeing how it panned out and not intervening. I mean, that must have been hard for you to do that.
It was, in terms of Javier and Maria, that one was hard. I told you the computer one happened first. Yeah. And so that's when, you know, it was like, I'm firing, you know, I'm going to let them figure out how to help each other. Then Javier and Camilla came up about 7 months later. So it was all fairly quick lessons all of a sudden. And then I started learning about positive deviance. So these lessons kind of piled up. And, you know, for me, then it was kind of a validation that the solutions are out there. At least you need to give people the time and space to figure it out, and that they often do need resources. So, you know, this approach, however, I think the first step was that not only were families stereotyped as not being capable, and certainly that they wouldn't help each other, which they really do. You know, if you get out of the way and that's their only solution, they really will. And they look for positive deviance. The other piece is really that somehow or other, one of the first challenges was that I would be told that, well, if we just give them money, like I would be paying the families for their surveys. To me, they were earning that money. Yes. I told them, we're not a charity, okay? That my mother hated charity. And if you try to give her money, she really was offended. She said, I'm not a panhandler. You know, I'm not here. I didn't come to this country to panhandle. And so for her, it wasn't just social workers. She didn't want money. So we're not UBI. We're not universal basic income. We're not give directly, you know, give them a little money and whatever. That was never what it was. My mother and my family and our friends came up here to really become productive and add to our society. And they wanted to be makers, not takers. And what they wanted to do is be in a system that invested based on their initiative that they took, which is the way, you know, the last story I'll tell you is that I was teaching at Princeton this last spring. And I was then made a part of what's called the E-Lab committee, which is they have an entrepreneur center at Princeton. And the E-Lab experiment is really where we actually, as mentors and faculty and whatever, basically take on groups of students that are trying to develop entrepreneurship ventures and provide them support and whatever. And they're able to then present to a committee and potential investors and all of that. And one of the projects was a group of students that were building, or I'm sorry, designing clothes for angry young people. Okay. Another one was a group of students that were actually going to try to sell crumpets, British crumpets in the United States. Okay, and so they had all us committee and we're spending time with them and they help them with presentations. They get presented to investors and, you know, just whole system of support and validation. It's like we validated these kids. So you guys are going to be the entrepreneurs of the future or whatever. It didn't matter what they were doing. It's like, just learn entrepreneurship, just, you know, take initiative, right? Well, as I'm watching these projects, my mother wanted to be a dress designer. And she had been doing it. She'd been making dresses for quinceañeras and whatever. And so she not only was a great dress designer and she had a customer base, that she was much further along as an entrepreneur than that group of students trying to design dresses for angry young people. And then our friend Camilla was doing catering, right? And so again, she also had a customer base. She'd been an entrepreneur for a while. And she was actually had more experience of this group of students trying to sell crumpets in the United States, but there was no similar support system for them, even though they were more advanced. And I'm looking at this and how different the system is for people that are coming from elite institutions or are privileged from the systems we've set up for people that are poor. All we give them is debt, microloans. And I could tell you, we would tell our students, do not start or try to expand a venture on debt. You have to start with equity. You know, that's the only way. And yet the message, you know, was going to the families I was working with that were very low income was, no, you start with loans. You go to Kiva, you go, you know, that's the only thing that you're given. And I'm over there, this isn't fair. You know, so we have systemic problems that we actually have to address.
Definitely. Yeah. Because I think, you know, this experience is fascinating with the whole family independence initiative, the work that you did and what you really kind of learned in retrospect. So it wasn't about kind of forward planning something. It was kind of you'd wait and see what happened and kind of learn from that. But would you describe the family independence initiative as a positive deviant in itself? So did you get other kind of early adopters of people coming forward and saying, we want to do that, we want to work in that way? Can we shape how we're doing things differently? So was there a kind of knock-on effect for kind of other organizations or other people in that space to kind of take that leap to do something else?
Quick answer is no.
Okay.
Essentially, for me, I kept thinking, you know, after 2 or 3 years of data, I thought, you know, of course, you know, people want social justice. They actually want to bring about change, and kept wondering why the system wasn't, you know, adjusting. And the issue often tended to be the funders. Yeah. That even if they agreed and they want to do something like this, if you have, let's say, you know, you're supposed to have a multiplicity of funders. So if you had 13 funders and you could talk 2 of them in terms of giving you flexible dollars so that the families could do whatever they wanted, you had another 11 that didn't want you to do that. And so, you know, the system itself is set up to really create problems for actually letting the families lead. Yeah. So the piece that has gained for FII, for FII in its original model of investing in initiative, no, actually, it's just starting now, and it's actually starting more internationally. It's coming back to the US. What has happened is, since I left FII, is that the piece that has been getting adopted more is just giving small amounts of cash. So we've gotten to some progress that at least families are trusted with a little bit of cash. And so we can just, but it's not really including them as the same way that the Princeton students are included, which is really that you guys actually need the investments that make sense to have your initiatives really grow. We'll give you 500 a year or 1,000 a year or something like that, and that's kind of it. And that's not what really. So internationally, we've started the Community Independence Initiative, mostly because what I learned is that this is actually more about community than a family.
Right.
That families really learn from the community. That's the issue of positive deviance. So the key portion is to rebuild that sense of community and mutuality within that community. So the Community Independence Initiative now is in 5 different countries. It's going into Uganda, Liberia, Mexico, Colombia, the Philippines, Singapore, and now it's coming back into New York in more its original model. Giving cash is okay. It's not a bad thing. At least it's trusting them with a little bit of money, recognizing the stereotype, and trusting families as a peer to those of us that want to do good. That's another leap.
Makes you wonder if you could ever bring about kind of mainstream change when we're still looking to the state to fund civil society. And I wonder if that will ever change, but we'll try.
Yes.
I think, well, finally, we're working alongside some really brave and switched on people who want to kind of make this shift away from fixing and towards more of that kind of investing in people, investing in communities, and really get out of the project and program game. And I wonder if you have any words of advice for those who are looking to take that leap of faith into the unknown.
Well, actually, we need early adopters. So we have some now. We have Children International. They're a $140 million NGO all over the world. And because they're so big, they have flexible dollars. I'll tell you, it's the funding piece that's hard. Yeah. They have flexible dollars, so therefore they can do this. The Child Center in New York, they serve 35,000 families, and yes, they have credibility, so they have some flexibility in their dollars. There's another groups in California, and there's a LLC in Uganda and whatever. If you as an organization have enough flexibility or have funders that will support doing something like this, we need actually more early adopters so that we can change, not the nonprofits. I get much more support from nonprofits. We have to change the funders so that you can actually do this whole thing. So yes, if you're interested in all that, basically contact me, and we are setting up what we are calling the Do It Yourself Center or Do It Together Center. It'll be an online platform where we'll give you access to the surveys, the approach, how to train your staff, and we're setting it up so that any grouping that wants to do this approach, because it's not dependent on us or a centralized organization, we are setting an approach to do that, but we do need early adopters all over the world. So just let us know, and we'd be willing to help.
Thank you. Now, is there anything that you were dying to say that I haven't asked you before I close?
Well, I think that last piece is that I don't think there's any one way to do this, that every community is a little bit different, but the basics are all that they are the only experts. So you can't deal with diversity if you try to package it. Yeah. That's the whole thing. So if you can accept the diversity and that you're not going to be central, that you will be secondary, what I can tell you is you're going to love it. Seeing families succeed because you got out of the way is actually extremely satisfying. It's much more satisfying than when I try to direct what the families would do. So yeah, I'd love to kind of expand this whole thing and hear from people.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And it's been such a pleasure. And I think your insight and experience has been an inspiration to so many of us. And I hope that we can now call you a new system ally.
Yes, that would be wonderful. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, that's weird listening to yourself for an hour. So I thought it would be good if we just have a 5-minute break. If we all come back just after 11:10, and I'll bring in a couple of colleagues, of friends, and we'll try and bring in some of the amazing comments that have been coming in from the chat. and just bash those around between us. Obviously, we're not going to have the answers to everything, but I think it'd be good just to kind of highlight and have that conversation. So go and grab a cuppa, go to the loo, and then we'll see you in 5 minutes. Hello and welcome back. Hope you all managed to have a little break there. Thanks for sticking with it. So I'm just going to welcome Catherine and Joanna. Don't know if you wanted to say a quick hello and introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Joanna. I work as a strength-based practitioner for an organisation in Kingston.
Hi, I'm Catherine, and I joined Mayday almost 2 years ago now, working in housing, but now moving to the PTS.
Okay, so thank you for being here. I'll kick off because there are a few themes from the chat and some of the questions that really stood out as I was going through those. Sorry if I can't answer everything. We will try and get something out at some point. I think one of the things that stood out to me was around how do we unprofessionalize and how do we unlearn? Because it sounds like such a hard thing to do, to not step in and not to help. And so something really in the chat around, you know, we need to start with us and we need to kind of reflect and hold up a mirror to ourselves. And I wonder if you could share any of your thoughts or experiences of having to do that.
I think for me, there's a huge power in language. And when you start trapping someone in a specific viewpoint, you start creating a tunnel vision for working with them, even for yourself. And I think part of the unlearning is looking at the power of words, which I know there's a seminar around that, but just looking at, hold on, am I trapping someone in a system because of how I'm viewing them, because of the words that have been presented in front of me? Or am I really truly seeing someone for who they are? The fact that I can be viewed as however I want to define myself, but someone accessing a service can't, there's something incredibly wrong with that. So it's things like that. Am I viewing that person as if I would view a family member or view myself?
Yeah. Catherine, what's your unlearning journey been?
Sure.
You've got like 15 minutes, but
It is just constant. It's so fascinating. It's so terrifying, and it's, you know, it's getting the balance with not, you know, discrediting the 28 years that I worked in a different way, and the things that I've, you know, the way I see things slightly differently now. But it's been such a fascinating journey, and it just never ever ends. I'm just constantly amazed at what the difference is and how subtle it is. And I know that in a lot of the chat we're talking about, there's something there now about dismantling the welfare state, which sounds a little bit big, and the start really is about listening to people. And it sounds so simple, and I would have sworn I'd listened to people. But I think I was listening to people and at the same time trying to find the solution and thinking about what was best for them and what they needed to do. Listening to people without doing that is a completely different experience. And not focusing on what services somebody might need, but kind of really finding out what they need. And yes, sometimes you do need help, sometimes you do need resources, sometimes you do need somewhere safe to stay. But you know, I'm not convinced that myself, my children would design a service as a solution to most of the things that we feel. So the unlearning is just never ending, absolutely exhausting, but so fascinating.
I think for me, also the unlearning is looking at, you know, what structures are there, and do they have this, you know, the person that I'm working with at the center, or are they just created to kind of measure them? And you know, is someone actually being listened to, rather than being listened through the filters that I've learned as being part of the sector, and things that I've learned because my funders want to know that information. And it's actually taking all those things away and actually really being open to that person. And that can be scary, especially when you've used your all your forms, or, you know, when you take all those things away and you're stripped to being two humans with each other. That can be really scary.
yeah, it can feel really exposing, can't it? And it's constantly struggling with that kind of the human nature to kind of step in and to do that fix and to make things better for people. And it's, you know, it's not a professional thing, it's a human thing. Because I remember speaking to one of our coaches once, and I said, what's the hardest thing about what you do? And they said, letting people fail for themselves and not jumping in with a solution, because they knew that if they trusted people, they would learn from that and come back again. But a question came in about how do we balance that duty of care in this sense? You know, how do we kind of balance safeguarding with letting people, you know, go where they want, do what they want, all of those sorts of things, especially when we do have, you know, housing, and we are organisations and we are paid professionals in that space. And I think, you know, even the COVID response has been a really interesting thing to reflect on when we're looking at that kind of balance of duty of care and leaving people be. Catherine, what do you think? Because I know you've been quite involved in that space.
I think for me, it's not seeing duty of care and safeguarding as a kind of situation to control and manage. And again, going back to what Joanne said, it's about how would you approach it with your own family or a friend or a child. You know, the way that people learn is having those conversations, having people to talk to, and just conversations. Whereas within services, what we very often do is see a risk and we want to get straight in there to get rid of their risk and control and manage it. And that can really kind of limit that person's ability to learn. And it's not how most of us will want our children to learn about life and risk and control and making choices. And also sometimes, you know, and it is really, really difficult because, you know, as an organisation, as an individual with responsibilities, I want to, you know, I don't want to be in a difficult position and regret not having done things. So sometimes, you know, you want to act because of your fear of something going wrong and feeling accountable. But again, you know, it's a difficult balance. But it's about, I think, moving away from trying to control and manage a person and their risk.
Yeah.
Conversation. I've recently been involved with someone who I work with a team who do kind of parallel work, and mine is sort of unrestricted and theirs is, and you know, there was a safeguarding alert made whilst I was still working with that person, but I didn't drive the safeguarding alert. And actually, in having a conversation with that person, it revealed what it was that he was needing most of all. And that conversation opened up a sort of lack of awareness that he had around the situation, and just kind of having a real world conversation with him about the reality of it empowered him to then make choices himself, whereas safeguarding would have just taken that away from him. And it, you know, it just put him at the center of it, instead of trapping him and defining the situation for him.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move on quickly to networks, because I think that was another thing that really came out. And I think the example that Mauricio was giving around people coming and bringing their networks, and I think that's something that's really stark work for the area of work that we work in, is that not everybody has those networks. You know, we've heard that in one of our wisdoms before. All I see is other people in the same situation as me and other professionals. And I think that's a really core part of what we try and do is to build those positive networks with people, and any experiences that you have as to how you've managed to do that.
I think for me, it's recognizing that people will have toxic relationships around them. I think we can all attest to having had toxic relationships around ourselves also, but it's empowering someone to experience positive relationships as well, so they can start seeking for those relationships. And I do have some real kind of examples of people that I've worked with who've started letting go of those toxic relationships because they've started to value themselves in a different way, and then introduce themselves to new networks through things of interest that they're, you know, really passionate about, people who have a common interest in an area that they've started exploring. And I think you can start getting new networks just through being exposed to areas that maybe you haven't been exposed to before. And it connects to resources and what Mauricio was saying about people needing resources, and kind of making it an even platform for someone to then access those networks.
Yeah, and doing that again whilst walking alongside somebody and not saying, oh, could you kind of, you know, can you help out this homeless person to come and enjoy your gym, or, you know, anything like that, but really building on where people want to go, where they want to be, and just coming along as Joanna or Lynn or Catherine and letting that happen quite organically. Don't know if you had anything to add on that, Catherine, around networks.
Well, just that again, it's about how, you know, we think of people differently. So, you know, when we say, well, what if somebody has no networks? What then? What do you do? Well, what if you or I moved to a new country or a new town and we had to start afresh? What would we do? It's the same. You know, we don't look for services. We think about what we do and what we're interested in, and that's what we do. Why is it different? Why do we need to manage that?
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that stood out to me when I was looking through the chat was around community, and really interesting around needing to not romanticize the golden age of communities. I think it was Becky who said that. I thought that was really interesting, that we need to move towards something new. And then also, I think it was Ol was saying around, well, what if community doesn't feel accessible? What if you are, you know, experiencing things in your life that community might not be very receptive to or have a very different view of, and that can be very difficult. And I wonder whether or not, as organisations and charities, we have a duty to challenge that. You know, I've been looking at my letterbox and all the Christmas appeals coming in through my door with the, you know, the homeless guy in a sleeping bag covered in snow. You know, isn't this terrible? We need to give him some money. And there's almost something around how we communicate with as organisations with charities, with communities, around perpetuating those stereotypes. I don't know what we do about that.
I don't know. I think I remember work about a few years ago doing an appeal at a local school, again, doing a bit of fundraising and really playing in that confirmation bias of, you know, don't give money to the guy begging because, you know, give it to charity so that we can impact people, we'll have a wider reach. And actually that ends up criminalizing someone. It makes them seem as though, you know, they're not worthy of having a relationship with someone, that all of a sudden they've been severed from community. And I think even just the language that we use and the power that has, looking at those sort of appeals that we do for organizations, and really teaching people about what it is to kind of have a relationship with someone without the fear that fundraising campaigns can have, or the language that we use. And I think communities can provide a lot more than organizations can. They can provide genuine relationships with people. As a professional, I have these boundaries in place, and I think being embedded in a community with people of common interest is just so much more powerful.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think we constantly have to battle and challenge with this every single day, and we should never stop, individually and as organizations. And you know, we're not born into a perfect community or necessarily the right community for us, so sometimes we have to find kindred spirits, like-minded people, and build our own kind of community and networks. But I mean, I had a sister who had cerebral palsy, and she died a few years ago. She was 27, and she spent all of her life being seen as somebody with cerebral palsy and trying to fit into society in terms of getting work, getting friends, being accepted. And she never felt accepted, she never felt valued, and she had incredible kind of skills. And it's made me think a lot about, you know, were we pushing her too much into what we thought should be her community, because we wanted her to achieve, and should we have allowed her more to find her own community where she felt that she belonged?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, there's lots of really difficult stuff in there.
Yeah, it's a big one. We could have a whole session on that, I think.
Yeah.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. Was there anything that you guys wanted to highlight or bring? Sorry, putting you on the spot a bit, but anything that you wanted to bring to the conversation? You don't have to. That was mean of me, wasn't it?
Well, I think it's just going back to the person. It's voice, power, and control, and that's the starting point for everything. So, you know, start there every time you're doing something, and from that, we will hopefully build a network of people that will challenge and change the system and what it's doing to people at the moment, whilst also realising that we all do need resources, support and help throughout our lives. Most of us are quite lucky that we have that. So it's not like pulling the whole rug from under people and saying, right, that's it, fend for yourself, the services are crap. It's not that at all. It is listening.
Yeah. And I think that's actually, oh, sorry, go on, Joanne.
I was just reflecting on a bit of research that I read recently that showed that it was looking at social class and health, and it showed that lack of choices, feeling cornered, and having limited options can cause coronary heart disease, pulmonary illnesses, and high cortisol levels. And I just think, as you know, this isn't a way of kind of bashing everyone but it's just an awareness of, you know, when we're working with people, about giving them an opportunity to have choices, being honest when there isn't choices. We still work within systems, and being kind of an ally to people and saying, you know, I get that this is frustrating, or I would feel exactly, you know, the same, or I would just a sense of being beside someone, because I just feel like this is what we're doing as a sector. And this is why we need a change in the system completely.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to wrap up now. The chat has been absolutely fantastic. I'm going to download that and have a proper look through it. But I think on that note, you know, the way that the Alliance is going to work is we're going to listen first. So we're not going to come with a solution to this. I think this is all of our space. So my call to action for everyone is to come forward, talk to us. We need to connect together. So this stuff will happen with individuals. It's kind of, we are potentially the positive deviants here. We need to look at that. So don't come alone. Do bring your networks. And I think this isn't a quick fix. We're not going to be coming up with solutions or answers. So it's really up to all of us to start to mobilize and hopefully be that challenge to the system, and model something new together, and we'll learn from each other. So thank you everyone for your time today. The video will be available on the website, and I think the YouTube video is being posted. We'll also share Viv's poetry as well, which I know was a great start to the day. So thank you all very much. It's lovely to share this time with you, and hopefully we'll see you at some point during the rest of the week. Thank you.
Bye.